Consider the scale of the thing for a moment. A cold, wet island on the edge of Europe, smaller than the state of Oregon, with no place in it more than 70 miles from the sea. By the middle of the 19th century, that island was producing 1/5 of everything manufactured on Earth. Half the world's iron, half its cotton cloth, 2/3 of all the coal dug from the ground anywhere on the planet came out of British mines. A nation that held perhaps 2% of the world's population was, for a brief and extraordinary moment, the workshop of the entire world. The question this video is built around is the one that economists and historians have argued over for 2 centuries, and it is more interesting than it first appears. Not was Britain rich? That much is obvious. The question is how. How did this particular small island, and not richer, larger, older civilizations, become the place where the modern industrial economy was first assembled? Because the answer is not one thing. It is an architecture, a set of pieces that happen to come together in one place at one time. And like any structure, if you remove the right piece, the whole thing fails to stand. Let's begin with the ground it was built on, literally, because geography did Britain an enormous favour before anyone lifted a finger. Beneath the island sat 2 things the industrial age would run on: vast deposits of high-quality coal and abundant iron ore, often close together. Above ground, no point in the country was far from the sea or from a navigable river, which meant heavy goods could move by water cheaply at a time when moving them by land was punishing. The surrounding sea did something else too, and it was a wall. While revolutionary and Napoleonic wars tore across the European continent in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, burning fields and bankrupting states, the English Channel kept that destruction off British soil. Investors could put money into a factory in Manchester with a reasonable confidence that an army wouldn't march through it. Stability is a resource, even though it never appears on a map. So, coal, iron, water, and a moat. That's the foundation. But foundations don't build themselves, and plenty of nations had coal and never industrialized. The next piece is the one most people skip, and it might be the most important of all. In 1688, Britain had a revolution, the Glorious Revolution, that, almost by accident, rewired how the country handled money and power. Power shifted decisively toward Parliament, and with it came something subtle and transformative: more secure property rights, and a state that could credibly promise to honour its debts. That sounds dry. It is, in fact, the hinge on which everything turns. Because in 1694, in the middle of a war, the government chartered an institution to lend it money, the Bank of England. It was created to fund warfare. That was its first job, financing the state's military ambitions. But its consequences ran far deeper than any battlefield. For the first time, Britain had a stable public market for capital. The government could borrow at lower and lower interest rates because lenders trusted it would pay them back. And as Adam Smith himself wrote, the bank acted not merely as an ordinary bank, but as a great engine of state. Here is why that mattered to ordinary ambition. Before institutions like this, capital, money to build something, was largely locked up among aristocrats and their connections. Afterward, a far wider range of people could access credit, raise funds, and finance a venture. Britain had, in effect, institutionalized entrepreneurship. The idea that a person of modest birth with a good idea could borrow money, build a factory, and grow rich was not a law of nature. It was a machine that Britain assembled, piece by piece, in the decades around 1700. Hold that thought, the engine of finance, because it is what made the next part possible to scale. Now the part everyone knows, though usually not why it happened here. From around 1760, A cascade of invention turned that financial and material foundation into raw industrial power. In 1709, Abraham Darby had already worked out how to smelt iron using coke instead of charcoal, unlocking cheap, abundant iron. Then came the steam engine, refined by James Watt into something that could drive not just pumps, but factories, locomotives and ships, a portable source of power that freed industry from the riverbank. Textile machinery multiplied the output of a single worker many times over. The railway, a British invention, stitched the country together and then the world. None of these inventions was inevitable, and none of them was an accident of genius alone. They happened in Britain because Britain was the one place that had all the surrounding pieces at once. The coal to fire the engines, the iron to build them, the capital to fund them, the secure markets to sell into, and a culture that, for a window of time, celebrated the practical tinkerer and the industrialist. By 1841, nearly half of all British workers were employed in industry. Adjusted for inflation, the nation's output quadrupled between 1780 and 1850. In 1851, Britain showed the world what it had become, in a palace built entirely of glass and iron, the Crystal Palace, and 6 million people, nearly a third of the country, came to look. We'll come back to that glass palace at the end, because it's the perfect image of the whole story, including the parts it left out. Because here is where an honest blueprint has to mark the load-bearing walls that don't appear in the celebration. Britain's wealth was not built by invention and finance alone. It was also built on trade that ran through empire, and a significant part of that early prosperity flowed from the Atlantic slave trade and the colonial system around it. The triangular trade moved manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved human beings across the Atlantic to the Americas, and the products of their forced labor, sugar, tobacco, and later raw cotton, back to Britain, where its factories spun that cotton into the cloth that clothed the world. The same East India Company that began as a trading venture ended up governing a subcontinent, extracting its wealth and reshaping its economy to serve British industry. Colonies served two functions in the architecture. They supplied raw materials, and they were captive markets compelled to buy British goods. To tell the story of British wealth and leave this out would be to hand you a building with a floor missing. It would look complete, and it would not be true. The achievement was real. The steam engine was real. The institutions were real. The ingenuity was genuine and world-changing. And the cost was also real, paid by people who saw none of the prosperity. Both of those things are part of the same structure. A serious account holds them together rather than choosing one. So when you stand back and look at the completed building, what do you actually see? You see that Britain's wealth was never a single cause. Not just coal, not just empire, not just clever inventors, not just banks. It was the convergence. Geography handed it fuel and a moat. The financial revolution handed it an engine for capital and a state that paid its debts. The Industrial Revolution handed it the machines. And global trade, including its darkest channels, handed it raw materials and markets at a scale no domestic economy could have supplied. Remove any one of those, and the others don't produce the same result. A country with coal but no capital markets stays poor. Capital markets with no resources fund nothing. Inventions with no markets gather dust. It was the assembly that was unique, and that assembly happened first and most completely on one small island. That is the genuinely remarkable thing, and it's the thing worth understanding, because the same principle applies to any fortune ever built, personal or national. Wealth is rarely one brilliant stroke. It is an architecture of pieces that have to stand together, which brings us back to that palace of glass. In 1851, it was the proudest object in the world, a cathedral of iron and light that could not have been built 20 years earlier, raised by a nation that had, in a single century, rewritten what a small country could be. It was a monument to ingenuity, and it was made possible by an economy whose foundations included both the patent office and the plantation. It burned down in 1936, and the empire that built it would be gone within a generation after that. But the blueprint of how that wealth was assembled, the institutions, the finance, the marriage of resource and machine and capital, that blueprint outlived the building and the empire, and is studied to this day. Because Britain did not just become rich, Britain drew the plans that much of the modern economic world was built from. The good and the terrible, the engine and its cost, all of it, in the same set of drawings.